The rain came down hard over the city that night, the kind of rain that makes the streets look like rivers of black glass. Samuel Whitfield leaned on the cold pavement outside the closed farmers, one hand pressed to his chest, his breath coming in short, frightened pulses. He was 68 years old, and for the first time in his life, he believed this how it would end, alone, forgotten, on a street he did not even recognize anymore. A young man knelt beside him in the rain. His name was David Bennett, and he was not supposed to be there. His shift at the hospital had ended 20 minutes early. His supervisor had already called his name twice, telling him to go home, that the ambulance crew would handle it. That one more case would not matter. But David did not leave. He took off his own jacket and laid it over Samuel's shoulders. He held the old man's hand and said words that surprised even himself. "I'm not going anywhere, you hear me? I do not know why, but I am not leaving you." He did not know it yet, but somewhere inside him, a death was calling itself home. What happened between these two men did not begin in that rain. It began 31 years earlier, in a small room above a hardware store, where a stranger once made a promise that no one will ever hear it say it out loud. 31 years before that night, Samuel Whitfield was not a man anyone noticed. He swept floors at the hardware store on Van Street and rented a single room above it. He had no wife, no children, and very little money. But he had habits that the other tenants in the building found strange. He always knew when someone was struggling, even when they said nothing at all. On the second floor of that same building lived a woman named Grace Holloway. She was 24, and she was raising a son alone. The boy's name was Daniel, though everyone, even his mother, would later call him David, after his father's middle name, once Grace remarried years later. But in this part of the story, he was still small enough to be carried, still too young to remember any of what was about to happen. Grace worked 2 jobs. She rarely complained, but Samuel noticed the things she never said. He noticed when her cupboard ran empty before the month did. He noticed the cough that lingered too long in her chest. He never offered her money directly. She was too proud, and he understood pride because he carried his own. Instead, he found quiet ways. He told her the landlord owed him a favor, and the rent was lower than it truly was. He told her a neighbor left extra vegetables when he really had bought them himself with the money he could not spare. He never once told her the truth. Then, one winter, Grace fell seriously ill. The hospital bills came fast, faster than her wage could ever follow. Samuel watched her grow thinner with worry, not just for her own health, but for what would happen to her son if she could not work. One evening, she did not come home from the hospital. The illness had taken her in the night, quietly, the way it often does to people who have spent their whole lives being quiet themselves. The building went still with grief. There was no family to call, no money for a service. The hospital spoke of unmarked arrangements, the kind reserved for those no one comes to claim. Samuel could not allow that. He sold one thing of value he owned, his father's old pocket watch, the only inheritance he had ever received, and combined it with every coin he had saved for 2 years toward a home of his own. It was not enough, so he asked the hardware store owner for an advance on wages he had not yet earned, and worked extra hours in silence to pay it back, telling no one why. He gave Grace Holloway a funeral with dignity, flowers, a proper stone, a few words spoken by a tired pastor in the cold. No one in that small gathering knew his name. He stood at the back, in a coat too thin for the weather, and said nothing when people assumed he was simply a neighbor paying respect. What almost no one knew was even Grace's sister, who took the baby in afterwards, never fully understood, was that Samuel had also quietly arranged a small fund for the boy, diapers, milk, a coat for his first winter. He delivered these things to the sister's doorstep at night, in plain bags, with no note, no name, nothing that could be traced back to a lonely man who swept floors and had nothing left to sweep for himself. Then Samuel did something the audience does not expect, and which makes this story different from any other story like it. He moved away, not out of shame, not out of fear of being discovered. He moved because the job at the hardware store had ended, and a cousin offered him to work in another city, and he needed to survive. He never told anyone what he had done. He never tried to find out what became of the boy. He simply carried the memory of Grace Holloway's kindness, the way she always greeted him properly, The way she once shared her own small dinner with him on the nights he had nothing, and he let that moment be enough. He never once expected anything in return. That is the whole point. He was not testing anyone. He was not waiting to be thanked. He simply could not walk past the need he was able to meet. 31 years passed. David Bennett grew up not knowing most of this story. His aunt, Grace's sister, raised him with love in a small house on the edge of the town. In a room that was once meant for storage but became, in time, a boy's whole world. She herself only knew fragments, a kind neighbor, a dad she could never properly repay because she never learned his name. She told David when he was old enough to understand. Someone help us when we had nothing. I don't know who, but because of him, you had milk when we were a baby. You had a coat when you were cold. Whatever you become, remember that kindness like that exists, even when it asks for nothing. David carried that sentence with him the way other children carry a favorite toy. He did not understand it fully as a boy, but he repeated it to himself on the night when his aunts worked late and the house felt too quiet, and somehow it made the quiet feel less heavy. He became a doctor, not a famous one, not a wealthy one. He worked long hours at a public hospital, the kind that takes everyone, whether they can pay or not, the kind where the waiting room is always full and the staff are always tired. His colleagues sometimes asked him why he stayed there instead of moving to a private clinic with better pay and shorter hours. David never had a complete answer. He only knew that something in him refused to walk past the people who needed help. When an elderly patient had no one to sit with them before surgery, David found himself pulling up a chair. When a mother could not afford her child medicine, David quietly asked the pharmacy to bill it to a small fund he kept topped up from his own salary, never mentioning it to anyone. His colleagues called it unusual generosity. David called it nothing at all. He did not know that this instinct had a name. He did not know its name was Samuel. Across the city, Samuel Whitfield had grown old without much family of his own. He had worked honest jobs his whole life, a hardware store, then a warehouse, then years as a maintenance man for a block of flats, not unlike the one he once lived in above Van Street. He never married. He never had children of his own to call him in the evenings. He lived simple, in a small flat with a single chair by the window, and most days, no one checked on him at all. He was the kind of man the world quietly forgets, not because he did anything wrong, but because he never asked anyone to remember him. That winter, his heart began to fail him. It started small, a tightness in his chest he blamed on the cold, a tiredness he blamed on his age. He told no doctor, he told no neighbor. He simply continued, the way he always had, carrying his hot quiet burdens alone, the same way he had carried Grace Holloway's secrets for 3 decades without one setting it down. This brings us back to where we began. Samuel collapsed outside the pharmacy on a night when the rain refused to stop. His supervisor had told David to go home. The ambulance crew was 20 minutes out, delayed by flooding 2 streets over. Any other night, David might have left, trusting the system to do its work. But something about the old man's face stopped him. He could not explain it. He only knew he could not leave. David stayed in the rain, holding Samuel's hand, talking to him so he will not lose consciousness, telling him about nothing in particular, the weather, the traffic, anything to keep him present. Samuel's eyes kept drifting close, and each time, David squeezed his hand a little tighter and said his name, pulling him back. Stay with me, sir. Just stay with me a little longer. When the ambulance finally came, David rode with him, even though it was not his job to do so, even though his shift had ended an hour before, and his own dinner sat cold and forgotten in his car. At the hospital, David fought for him. He pushed for tests that a bizarre doctor might have skipped, arguing quietly but firmly with a senior colleague who thought the old man's case was routine. He stayed past midnight reviewing Samuel's charts under the buzzing fluorescent lights of an empty office, noticing a complication the night team had missed, a small irregularity that, left untreated until the morning, could have been fatal. It was a small thing, the kind of careful attention that cost his daughter sleep and ends in nothing, except, in this case, it saved Samuel's life. Samuel did not know why this young daughter cared so much about the old man with no family and no man. He only knew that for the first time in many years, Someone had refused to let him be invisible. In the days that followed, as Samuel recovered in a narrow hospital bed by the window, the two men began to talk. Samuel was lonely, and David found himself returning to the old man's bedside, even when his shift did not require it, sometimes bringing 2 cups of tea from the vending machine and sitting in the plastic chair beside the bed until visiting hours ended. They spoke of many things, the weather, and all radio programs Samuel still listened to. The garden David's aunts used to keep. Samuel asked about David's family, and David, almost without thinking, mentioned his aunt, and the mother he never knew, and the story his aunts always told him about a stranger who paid for a funeral and left milk and coats on the doorstep with no name attached. He told it as a story, a nice memory, nothing more. Samuel went very quiet. His hands, resting on the blanket, had gone still. It was the mention of the street, Van Street, that it did. Samuel asked, carefully, trying to keep his voice from shaking, what his aunt's name had been. Holloway, David said. Grace Holloway. She passed before I could ever know her. I was just a baby. Samuel closed his eyes. 31 years folded into that small hospital room. He did not announce himself with grand words. He did not need to. He told David slowly about a hardware store on Van Street, about a young mother who shared a dinner with a stranger who had nothing, about a winter funeral with no name attached to the flowers, about diapers and milk left on the doorstep in the dark. David sat in silence as pieces moved into place. The man whose life he had refused to walk past in the rain was the same man who, 3 decades earlier, had refused to walk past his mother. Neither of them had known. Neither of them had planned it. This is what made it true. David did not weep from sadness. He wept because he finally understood the shape of an instinct he had carried his whole life without a name for it. An instinct planted in him before he could even remember, by a man who never once asked to be thanked. You don't owe me anything, Samuel had finally said, his voice thin. You didn't even know. Neither did you, David answered. 30 years ago, you didn't know me either. You just couldn't walk past us. Samuel made a full recovery. He did not return to his small, quiet flat to be forgotten again. David made sure of that, not out of obligation, but because some kindnesses are not meant to end where they started. They are meant to circle back, find their way home, and stay. My friends, here is what this story asks of us. Kindness rarely announces itself. It does not wait for an audience. It does not keep score. Samuel Whitfield never once expected this small act of love to return to him. He gave because giving was right, not because he hoped to be repaid. He moved to another city. He let the memory rest. He never once searched for the boy he had quietly fed and clothed. Never once wondered if the world would one day balance its book in his favor. And yet, 31 years later, in the rain, on a night when everything in David Bennett told him to go home, something older than memory told him to stay. Not a debt he could name, not an obligation written anywhere, just an instinct, planted in him before he could speak, by a man he never met and will not recognize for weeks. This is what we so often forget. We think kindness is a transaction that we give, and somewhere a ledger keeps a score, and one day the account is settled. But real kindness does not work this way. It plants something. It becomes part of who the person is, long after the giver has been forgotten, long after the giver has stopped expecting anything at all. Grace Holloway's gratitude became David's instinct. Samuel's quiet sacrifice became a habit that lived inside a boy who never knew his name. Perhaps kindness is never truly lost. Perhaps it simply waits, patiently, sometimes for 31 years, for the right night to come home. Here is a single question for each one of you, my friends. Has anyone in your life ever helped you without knowing they were repaying a kindness from long ago? Tell me your story below. I read every single one. Until next time, stay kind, stay wise. This is Mlu. God bless.